Welcome to Mafiocracy Now here on Best Evidence. My name is John Titus. It has been some time since I've made a video, about 3 months. Not too much has happened in that time. I moved from Chicago. That was one thing. That's just a personal matter. I'm now in rural Indiana. In the monetary world, not all that much groundbreaking is happening. There has been one major shift, though, in that central banks are now openly expressing their willingness and their intention to move to central bank digital currencies. And if that move takes place, that will be a major change, not just monetarily, but legally too, at least here in the US. And so that's really what I want my focus to be in season 3 here, is I'm going to look at the monetary system and really through a legal lens and through an historical lens, because I think that unless we understand where the system has been, it's very difficult to comprehend where it's going and understand fully where it's going. So I want to spend a considerable amount of time going over that. As I say, the central bankers have been pretty forthright about wanting to move to central bank digital currencies. Don't worry now if you don't understand that. I'll cover that in future episodes. What I want to focus on now is the reason that they feel the need to move away from the presently configured system. The currently configured system is a debt-based monetary system, and as it is implemented right now, it is over. The ball game is over for the debt-based monetary system that we have in place right now. The snake has begun eating its tail. When you have a debt-based monetary system and you want to create $1,000, that $1,000 of new money is created as new debt. And the problem with that is that at the end of the year, say, you can account for where the principal to repay that debt is going to come from, because whoever the issuer was, whether it was a commercial bank issuing the $1,000 or the central bank, the Federal Reserve issuing the $1,000, you know where the principal is going to come from because they issued it at the beginning of the term of the loan. More problematically, though, is where the interest payment is going to come from. And basically what gets set up here and the monetary system, and the fundamental problem with it is it's a game of musical chairs. Because at the end of the year, the borrower needs to pay back, say, $1,100. You can account for where $1,000 of principal is going to come from, but where is the $100 going to come from? And that creates a problem. Like I say, it's like a game of musical chairs. And if you look at the history of the Federal Reserve going back to 1913, you can very clearly see the progression of losers in this debt-based monetary system, the game of musical chairs. In 1920, the agricultural sector starts getting hollowed out. In 1920, the agricultural sector starts to get hollowed out. Big Great Depression in 1920, they go down then. In the 70s, manufacturing starts to get hollowed out. It gets taken out. In the 90s, productive services gets taken out. And finally, in 2008, we see that the parasite itself starting to wither away and eat itself. And that was the great financial crisis of 2008, when the financial sector starts to turn in on itself. And that's when the system really started to come to an end. And now here we are in 2020, and you can see what's happened. I mean, the Federal Reserve just added $3 trillion to its balance sheet. As I showed you in the Fed silent takeover, about $2.9 trillion of that made it into the so-called real economy, made it to our bank circuit where we could access that money. And yet today we hear screams and howls from people saying, hey, I need money to pay my rent. I need money I'm going to get foreclosed on. I need to pay my mortgage. I need groceries. I got to pay utilities. I've lost my job. And, $3 trillion is a lot of scratch. That shakes out to $10,000 a head in the US. Really, $25,000 per household is the way to look at that. So why, with all that money floating around the system, what's going on here? Why didn't it really fix the problem? And the answer is, look where the money went. $1 trillion out of that $3 trillion that the Fed packed onto the balance sheet found its way to billionaires. Yeah, 1/3 of the $3 trillion went to billionaires. I mean, how much went to millionaires? 2/3? The point is that the system is fundamentally dysfunctional and it's falling apart. And we need to abandon the debt-based monetary system. That, however, is not going to happen. A rational person would abandon the game of musical chairs and move from a debt-based monetary system to a system of actual money, where you create money and there's no debt attached to it. There's no interest payment attached to it. That's how a rational person would handle this situation. The monetary powers that be, however, are addicted to the control they have through the debt-based monetary system. So what they are planning to do is to move from a macro-based debt system where, for example, they pack $3 trillion onto the balance sheet and they just stand back and watch the cards fall where they may, including a third of them going to billionaires. Okay, they're going to move from that system, and their solution is now not to abandon the debt-based monetary system, but to go to a micro-based monetary system where what they plan to do, and again, they're open about this. There was a Zoom call or conference call back in October that included the IMF and Augustin Carstens, the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, and Jerome Powell, and they got together and they talk about CBDCs, and they openly talk about here's what would happen, is that right now no normal person, regular people, don't have accounts at the Federal Reserve. The only people with accounts at the Federal Reserve are the U.S. government, commercial banks, and other central banks, foreign central banks, and that's it. And what the powers that be are now talking about is changing that system where you and I would have direct accounts with the Federal Reserve. So the system, right now I've said repeatedly on this channel, there are two monetary circuits, and we do not have access to reserve money that's created by the Federal Reserve. The reserves go to banks and they stay in commercial banks. We don't have access to them. And what the Feds and what the central banks are now proposing is that individuals would have accounts with their central banks. And so you'd have a mainline connection from the Federal Reserve to you and me. And there are some major legal problems with that. And there's also the issue of control with that. In that seminar, in that conference call I'm talking about, Carstens from the BIS is so excited about the control that will give central banks over every single transaction. Where you try to go buy a bag of Cheetos, no, central bank won't allow it because it doesn't fit their plans. They have other objectives. And Carstens is very upfront in that seminar, and I'll link to it in the description box. But he's very upfront about, wow, I'm really excited about this. We can control every transaction, basically, that's going to go through CBDCs. Isn't this exciting? Yeah, it's exciting for you, pal. Not for the rest of us. It's horrifying. And to his credit, give Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, give him credit. Jay Powell's reaction to Carstens, almost peeing in his pants with excitement over the control he's going to have over every $100 in the system. Jay Powell reacts like you would expect someone with Jay Powell's background to react. And Jay Powell says, wait, whoa, big boy. There's some, there may be some great things about CBDCs, but we have some real legal issues to think through. And the legal issue that Powell cited was privacy, meaning your privacy and my privacy over our transactions. That's not really what he's worried about. What the banks are really worried about, and what the New York Fed in particular is worried about. I know they're worried about this because I read a lot of transcripts. I've seen it, and I think Powell's probably aware of it. Powell's a smart guy. He's a savvy guy. I suspect that he was brought in. He's the first lawyer in the Fed in a long time. I think since the 70s. And now when I saw that seminar or that conference call about the CBDCs, I understood, okay, this is why this guy's brought in. But this is a major legal change. And the legal change is this. If the Fed is directly issuing money, it brings up a big question about agency, which is that isn't it true then, if the Fed is directly issuing money, that it has now stepped into the constitutional shoes of Congress and the Treasury by issuing money itself? In other words, why do we need the Fed at all? Isn't the Fed really functioning as the government? And if that happens, the Fed, I imagine Powell can entertain fantasies and, really nightmares of getting Freedom of Information Act requests to the effect of, well, since you are now acting as the U.S. government and issuing money directly to the people, how about answering this request? For each and every one of the 12 federal district banks in the Federal Reserve System, the private banks, let's see your financial records and your monetary records, basically every record, for the last, 107 years. Let's start with that, and you get back to us on that. And if you think the Fed would dismiss a lawsuit like that out of hand, I must remind you of the case that Mark Pittman brought back in 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. Freedom of Information Act request. Do you remember Pittman? Pittman was a reporter at Bloomberg, and he brings an FOIA. He submits FOIAs to the Fed. The Fed doesn't deny him. Pittman takes him to court. He wins in the Southern District of New York on summary judgment. He then wins again on appeal. The powers that be are freaking out. They appeal to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court won't hear it. Mark Pittman won that lawsuit. Now, the footnote to that story is at 52 years old, Mark Pittman has a heart attack and dies. Interesting aside there. But the point of this is that the Fed can lose in court. And a wild card like a lawsuit over Freedom of Information Act requests is not something that Jerome Powell or really anyone at the Fed wants to entertain. And they understand that there are very serious issues about the Fed issuing money directly. It's currently configured, the Fed right now issues reserves, which, for sure they're not legal tender. As I say, they're in a circuit with just commercial banks and other central banks and the U.S. government. They don't reach you and me, so it's not legal tender. They do issue, or they do have cause to be printed, Federal Reserve notes, and those are legal tender. But, keep in mind that, the Treasury prints those. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing prints those. And you might say, well, that's a straw man because it's really the Fed who orders those Federal Reserve notes to be printed. And that's true. But there is a straw man. The CBDC system, there's no straw man. The Federal Reserve is issuing money directly to people. So it's like, well, why do we need you? Congress could do that to the Treasury. It has done it in the past. As recently as the 60s, I think it was issued Treasury notes or silverback certificates. The Treasury can issue its own paper. It doesn't need the Fed to do that. So again, I think the Fed is a little bit wary of running the risk of stepping into the shoes of the government a little bit too much. And as I say, blurring the line of agency and then opening itself up to a rather massive dose of transparency, which they don't want. Those private banks that issue the money right now from the Fed, they don't want transparency. They got a lot to hide, no doubt about it. So anyway, we're going to get into that over the course of this season of episodes. I'm going to lay this all out really clearly. I'm going to go into those Freedom of Information Act lawsuits. There was another one by Fox where Fox lost a suit. So we want to see, when is the Fed public and when is it private? When it matters, it's private. That's what the system is. It's just a shuck and jive to get you to think that it's the government, and it's not. Only rubes think that the Fed is the government. It's private banks. That's what the Fed is. And we're going to get into that. The first thing we want to get into, though, that I need to get into, I went back and looked at some of my previous work and felt a sense of shame. I have totally failed to explain what reserves are. I have done a decent job of explaining that there are two different monetary circuits in the U.S. Think of it as two different systems with a heart at the center of each one and a bloodstream surrounding each one. In one system, the Fed pumps out the money. It pumps out reserves. The reserves circulate in that system between commercial banks, other central banks, and the U.S. government. And then the second system, our system that we use, the money is created by commercial banks. And I show that in a video called Mommy, Where Does Money Come From? The commercial banks create that money out of thin air, just like the Fed creates reserves out of thin air. And that money, the bank money that we have, our checking accounts and savings accounts, our money is circulates among basically anybody who's not a commercial bank. So it's not only we the people on the ground, it's also businesses. It's basically any business that is not a commercial bank, including credit unions and insurance companies. They're all in the commercial bank system, that other system. So those are the two systems. And I've done a decent job of saying, those are two different monetary circuits. But what I've failed to do, utterly failed to do, I've fallen on my face, I was kind of embarrassed when I look back at it, is answer the question, why do we need reserves at all? Why is there a second system? And I have totally failed to do that. So in this episode, what I want to do is to explain what reserves are, where they come from, and why you have to have them in the currently configured debt-based monetary system. They serve a very necessary purpose. And so I want to walk through that because you have to understand reserves to really get a handle on the system and to understand where the system's going and to understand what changes are being proposed to the system. So let's start and let's dig in with reserves. And the way I want to do this is I want to use a kind of a thought experiment, purely hypothetical, as you'll see in a second, where you are played, let's call you the High Plains Drifter. You've got $500, but you do not have a bank account. You have no way to do electronic banking, and you want to change that. Maybe you want to do some banking online or go to the mall and swipe your card like all the cool kids or whatever. But you come into my bank and you deposit $500 and you want me to open an electronic bank account for you. I, in this scenario, am the president and owner of the Cool Cat Bank, spelled with a K, just like the cigarettes. Anyway, I think when we walk through the system and you see, what your options are, I'm going to walk you through the options that you have once you open your bank account in my bank at the Cool Cat Bank. I'm going to walk you through your options, and it will become very clear to you what the role of reserves is. Reserves has a few functions, but there's one function in particular that is absolutely critical. Regardless of the fact, now keep in mind that the reserve requirement has now gone in the U.S. It used to be 10%. That went by the wayside in March of this year. The Fed got rid of that requirement. And yet, despite the fact that the reserve requirement is zero, reserves are still crucial to the system. And by walking through this sort of thought experiment, you're going to see and understand why reserves are crucial to the system and why we have a need for them at all. So let's do that. Let's kind of walk through that example. Okay, so here we are with a bird's eye view of the Cool Cat Bank. You've just deposited $500. That $500 shows up on the asset side of the Cool Cat Bank ledger here. I also have a liability side. There's nothing here as of yet. This is inside the Cool Cat Bank down here. Outside is another institution. We'll get to that in a minute. We have a problem right away, though. Actually, two problems. One, from your point of view, you didn't get what you came for. You don't have any bank account, and that's what we need. From my point of view, the problem is I have a balance sheet that really doesn't balance. I've got $500 in assets. I do not have a corresponding liability. So let's fix both problems in one fell swoop by setting you up with what you came to get, which is a Cool Cat bank account with the cool ears. And we're going to deposit $1, $2, $3, $4, $500. There's 5 electronic marbles. They're $100 each. They're red because legally they are IOUs from me, the president and owner of Cool Cat Bank, to you, the Cool Cat Bank customer. And so now what we can do is we can fix the balance sheet to reflect the balancing act here. And there's $500 in assets. You have an account ready to go, electronic account ready to do whatever you want to do, transact business, wheel and deal. And you were set up and you were ready to do business. So let's just kind of walk through your options. Okay, there are a couple of things to note here. Number one, that $500 of cash, you no longer own that money. You did before you came in. Once you deposit the $500 cash into the Cool Cat Bank, you become legally an unsecured creditor of the bank. And that's just the legal reality of the banking system. Number two, these red marbles, the $100 marbles, they're assets to you. You can go out and spend these. They're worth money to you, but they're liabilities to me. They're IOUs. I just write them. I cannot go. The Cool Cat Bank, can't go out and spend these red marbles any more than you can walk into Best Buy with your electric or gas bill and start buying merchandise. They're going to say, sir or ma'am, that is not the proper form of payment. Try again. So these are liabilities to me. I don't have any motivation to steal these. I have a motivation to get rid of these. And we're going to see that come up in a minute. But that's the reality. So now that we've got that sort of, convention out of the way, let's go back into the Cool Cat Bank and see what your options are in terms of how you're going to transact business. The first move you can make is sort of to undo what you did when you walked in, and that is you go, at least in part, and let's say you want to go out and you want to go drinking and you want a record of how many Harvey Wallbangers you drink. So you're going to take out $200 from the ATM machine, and out comes $200 from the asset side of my bank. And then the only really record we have, since you're spending cash and nobody can really know what you're doing with that money, there is a record in the bank, though, of what happened. And that is cash has been reduced, my assets have been reduced by $200, but my liabilities have been reduced by $200 because you've dipped into your electronic account. But you think better of going out on a bender, so you want to undo that. And now we come to move number two. Move number one is you got cash out. Move number two is you go online on Craigslist, on eBay, and you find somebody who's selling $200 worth of used books. This person's name is Liz. As it turns out, Liz also banks at the Cool Cat Bank, which is really convenient because you want to transfer $200 to Liz, which is going to be easy for me to delete $200 electronic dollars out of your account and to create $200 electronic dollars into Liz's account. And that's really kind of a trivial change in the balance sheet, but it is sort of a change, I guess. It's just changed the liability side. There's been a $200 reduction in liabilities to you, and there's been an increase of $200 in liabilities to Liz, and that's really sort of, like I say, that's kind of a trivial transaction to pull off. But that is, in fact, transaction number two. Okay, there are a couple things to note about this transaction with Liz. Notice that what's happened legally. Notice what we just did very carefully. You took $200 of IOUs from me to you, and you sold them to a third person. The normal rule is that contracts for debt are not negotiable. Traditionally and historically, courts would look at an IOU from one person to another, from A to B, and B couldn't sell that note to someone else. Well, he could, but if he tried to enforce it in a court of law, the courts would say, no, that's a private contract between a debtor and a lender, and you can't just sell that down the river and expect a court to come in and enforce it. That's a matter of that's a business transaction between two other private parties. Court's got nothing to do with that. We're not going to enforce it as against a third party. That began to change, though, in England in the early 1700s. Courts were ruling that way. They were ruling against banks who were trying to sell their notes like that. Basically, it was sort of the advent of modern banking, and the courts were not uniform about it. And so what the bankers did is they went to Parliament and they got the Promissory Notes Act of 1704 passed that allowed debts, that allowed IOUs like the one from me to you to be sold to third parties like Liz. And thus began a long series of legal advancements or legal encroachments by banks, which made debts from banks, made their liabilities negotiable, and have ultimately turned their liabilities, IOUs, into money where they are to this day. They're considered money. Legally, they're not really money, which I'm going to get to in another episode. But that's sort of the historical underpinning of the transaction from you to Liz. Banks made inroads. There were a lot of other hurdles they had to clear, but that was one of the first ones, was the non-transferability or non-negotiability of debt. So anyway, with that out of the way, you have two transactions out of the way. Let's go back into Cool Cat Bank World and see what your third move might be with respect to your new electronic bank account. Okay, so you've reconsidered the sale of the purchase of books from Liz. You want to undo that transaction. You think better of it. So we get the money back in your account. Liz is out of the picture now. And now you go back to eBay, you go back to Craigslist, and you find this guy named Jim. Jim's selling $20 of gold coins at face value. It's a deal of a lifetime. He's selling a $20 face value gold coin that's worth $2,000 or $3,000. He's selling 10 of them. So he's selling for $200. You're looking to pick up $40,000, maybe $50,000 of gold coins. You want to do this deal in a hurry. Problem is, Jim doesn't bank at the Cool Cat Bank. Jim banks in another bank, and his bank is the Jolly Jester. And you see the Jester's hat on Jim's bank account, and it's set up just like Cool Cat, the Jolly Jester is. They got assets on the left and liabilities on the right. And what you want to do in a hurry is you want to get $200 from you into Jim's account. Okay? And that's fine with me, the Cool Cat Bank, because I've just gotten rid of $200 in liabilities. But guess what? There's going to be a problem with that transaction, because the Jolly Jester is going to be like, wait a minute, you want me to take on your liabilities. What's in it for me? You've just wrecked my balance sheet. You've just added $200 in liabilities to my side, and on my side, Cool Cat Bank side, I've reduced liabilities by $200. I'm fine with that. But the Jolly Jester man, He ain't cool with that. And you know what? He's right about that. So we've got to figure out a way to make this transaction go through. So let's figure that out now. How can we make this transaction go through? Well, there's a couple ways we could do it. Okay, one way we could try to make this transaction work and make Mr. Jolly Jester square in this transaction so he's not sitting with the $200 hole in his balance sheet is we could just transfer good old-fashioned cash over to Jolly Jester. And that would square him up. He'd have $200 in new assets on his asset side of his balance sheet, and he'd have $200 of more liabilities on his liability side, as we just saw, and that would square everything up. The problem is that Jolly Jester Bank is in Modesto, California. Cool Cat Bank is sitting here in Vietnam, Indiana, and that's not going to fly. You want to close this deal now, and I get it because that deal's not going to last. You need electronic money, and the Cool Cat Bank needs electronic money, but it can't be red marbles because red marbles are liability. What I need is electronic asset. So what I really need is, let's just say, white marbles. And white marbles would be an IOU, only they're not an IOU from me to someone else. They're an IOU from someone else to me. And they just like red marbles, they'd be $100 a throw. And now the only question is, do those white marbles exist? And if so, who is the someone else who would be issuing IOUs to me? And the answer to that is that someone else is the Federal Reserve, and they don't really issue white marbles, of course. They actually issue reserves. And this is the function of reserves. If you think about it, Federal Reserve liabilities, you contract those words together, reserve liabilities shrinks down to reserves, and that's what reserves do. And with reserves, we can make this now transaction work, and we can make the transaction work instantaneously. So let's go back in Cool Cat Bank world and watch how this would work. So the way this would work is, let's undo what we have here so far and get back to ground zero and get the liabilities back over here to this side. And now what I need to do, and I hadn't shown you this before because there was no need to know, you need to know that actually I, Cool Cat Bank, am sitting on $1,500 in reserves. I've got 15 white marbles over here. The corresponding liabilities I also didn't need to tell you about. I've got $500 equity. That's really good. That's money in my pocket, but it shows up as a liability. And I've got, say, a $1,000 bond sitting and everything balanced, sitting on the liability side, and everything balances out. But now we are in a position to make the transaction between you and Jim to get Jim's gold coins work. So just like before, we would transfer $200 from you into Jim's account, and now Jolly Jester, he's got his own reserve account. We don't know how much is in it. Maybe the reserves are hidden behind a trap door down there, but we can transfer $200 of reserves to the Jolly Jester reserve account, and now the transaction balances out. It balances out on my side because I have reduced reserves by $200 and I've reduced liabilities by $200, and it works out on Jolly Jester's side. He has increased reserves by $200, and he's also increased liabilities by $200 due to Jim's account being credited with basically your money. And so that is how that transaction would work. And that is really the function of reserves. It's a counterbalance to bank money. So reserves issued as IOUs by the Federal Reserve to commercial banks function as a counterbalance to bank money, which is IOUs from me, the bank, to you, the customer, and really for all banks operate that way. That is the essential function of reserves. And notice here that even though the reserve requirement has been gone, it was dispatched in March of 2020, this year, we still need reserves to make these transactions go through. Otherwise, Jolly Jester stands up and says, no, I'm not going to have any part of this transaction. But that's the bottom line use of reserves, and that's really their core function. And in some countries, they're actually called like exchange settlements or some such thing. But that's ultimately what reserves do. They are the sort of hidden oil, the hidden lubrication in the monetary machine that enables transactions to go through and makes balance sheets balance out. Otherwise, these transactions would hang up and they wouldn't go through. Okay, now realistically, what I just showed you was transferring reserves in real time. That actually doesn't go on. Reserves actually transfer at the end of the day, and typically there's a lot more than just one transaction to balance out. Take two big banks like Citigroup and JP Morgan. I mean, God only knows how many transactions there are between those two customers. The customers of those two banks could be tens of thousands, could be hundreds of thousands. But the point is that at the end of the business day, all the transfers one way are added up, and all the transfers the other way are added up, and they're netted out, and they're settled with reserves. Okay, so that's point number one. What I gave you was sort of an unrealistic transaction, but it is very realistic in terms of the counting and in terms of the mechanics and the mechanism by which transactions are settled. That much is totally real. The other thing to note is that it wasn't always this way. We haven't always had electronic banking. We haven't always had the Federal Reserve. How did people settle transactions, 150 years ago? The answer is they'd settle in gold. And that was really what they did. The two banks would get together in a room. They would look at their liabilities flowing each way, both in banknotes and in checking accounts, just like now. And they would balance out their transactions that way, and they'd settle them up in gold. And that was that. They wouldn't do it every day, probably be every week, every 2 weeks, but they'd have a prescribed location where they were to get together and do that, and that's how business was done. That gets to like the third really and final point here, which is notice that reserves it really has nothing to do in the modern age, since they have the opposite polarity, reserves, the white marbles, and they they travel in a different circuit. They really do nothing to prevent bank runs. We're kind of taught in school like, well, you have to have reserves. You have to have that 10% reserves in case people come in looking for the money. Nah, no, you don't. It's not going to help you at all. The only thing that's going to help you if customers come in wanting to get their money out is to have cash on hand. Totally different things. Reserves have nothing to do with that. Now, back in the day, 150 years ago, how much gold the bank had on hand, that mattered. That counted. They wanted to avoid runs, and they needed, the psychology of being able to show people the gold bars and the vault and the wealth. That's a big deal when you're issuing a lot of more paper than you can back up. Now, though, reserves have nothing to do with it. But that's the core function of reserves. Like I explained in this example, it's lubrication in the monetary system. That's not their only function, but that's the essential function. Next time, I'm going to show you how reserves are misused and how they're increasingly abused by the Federal Reserve as the debt-based monetary system teeters and it is falling over, and it's just falling onto its face as we speak, and it's just not working. And the Federal Reserve is totally abusing reserves now. I'm going to show you that next time. I'm going to dot an I that I left undotted from last season, where I showed you the Federal Reserve creating $3 trillion of reserves, packing onto its balance sheet, and how that resulted in the creation of $2.9 trillion or whatever it was in bank money. I'm going to show you how that's done and how the Federal Reserve can dial up how much it wants bank money to be created for every dollar in reserves. It can dial up for every dollar reserves that the Federal Reserve creates. It can create anywhere between 0 cents and 100 cents of bank money. It can force the creation by commercial banks of bank money for reserves in quantitative easing. So we'll get to that next time. I hope this presentation has sort of helped you understand reserves. Kind of working through it in my mind helped me understand really what's going on with reserves. And we need to understand what's going on with reserves to understand what the problems with the monetary system now and what the monetary system is going to become, what the powers that be see is a solution for getting out of a teetering monetary system. It's gonna get interesting. So anyway, those are in future episodes. I hope this also gave you a flavor for the sort of topics I'm going to cover with sort of the history, a little bit of history of the money, and a little bit of the legality of the money. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Greatly appreciated, and I will see you next time.